The morning sun was warm over Los Angeles. Banners for a global charity filled the streets. People were gathering to see actors, leaders, and musicians arrive to raise funds for children who had lost their homes in fires. Cameras flashed, reporters called names, and the crowd grew louder with every passing minute. Everyone was waiting for one person to appear, Sandra Bullock, whose kindness projects had inspired many across the world. Her car moved slowly through the sea of fans. She smiled gently through the window, trying to calm her nerves. She had been to many events before, but this one felt different. Maybe because it was about rebuilding lives, not just collecting donations. As the car stopped, security opened the door, and Sandra stepped out wearing a simple white dress and a soft smile. She waved at people and said, "Thank you for being here." The cheers grew louder. Camera lights turned the street into a wall of brightness. Sandra took a small step forward, but suddenly the crowd behind the barriers started to move. Someone pushed, another shouted, and soon the metal fences began to bend. Security shouted to hold the line, but the pressure was too much. Sandra tried to move back, but she was trapped. People were pressing from every side, voices turning from excitement to panic. Her heart raced. She could barely breathe. She called out for help, but the sound of the crowd swallowed her voice. Flashes from cameras made it hard to see anything clearly. For a moment, everything blurred. The noise, the light, the movement. She felt her balance slipping as the people pushed forward. She tried to stay calm, whispering to herself, "Just breathe, it will be fine." But fear began to take hold. Then, out of nowhere, a man's voice spoke near her ear, calm and steady, saying, "Hold on, you're safe." She felt a strong arm move in front of her, another behind her, forming a barrier against the crowd. The weight pushing against her eased slightly. The man moved slowly, guiding her toward the side of the road, keeping his body between her and the chaos. The guards recognized him a second later. It was Keanu Reeves. He had arrived quietly, without cameras, without security shouting his name. He saw the crowd losing control and moved without thinking. He used his arms to shield Sandra, holding his ground even as dozens of people pushed forward. One camera caught the moment. The calm look in his eyes, the way he bent slightly to protect her from falling. The crowd's noise began to fade as police and guards restored order. Keanu helped Sandra back to her car, his hand steady on her shoulder. Her voice trembled as she said, "Thank you." He simply smiled and said, "You're safe now." Then, before anyone could speak again, he stepped back into the crowd and disappeared. Inside the car, Sandra sat in silence. Her heartbeat slowly returned to normal. Through the tinted window, she could see people pointing in the direction Keanu had gone. Some were calling his name, others were filming. But he was already gone. No interviews, no attention, no spotlight. He had done what was right, then vanished like a quiet shadow. As the car moved forward, Sandra felt a strange mix of relief and confusion. Why had he disappeared so suddenly? He was supposed to be part of the same event, yet he didn't show up for the red carpet, the speeches, or the dinner. Her assistant whispered, maybe he didn't want the cameras, but something about his eyes in that moment stayed in her mind. They didn't just look protective, they looked as if he was holding something deeper, something unsaid. Hours later, the internet exploded. Clips of Keanu shielding Sandra spread across every platform. Headlines called him a real-life hero. Fans from around the world praised his humility and courage. But Keanu didn't respond to any message. His phone was silent, his social accounts untouched. It was as if he had disappeared from the city. That night, Sandra sat on her hotel balcony, watching the lights of Los Angeles twinkle below. She couldn't shake the image of him pushing through the crowd, his calm face, his quiet strength. She wondered what drove him to act so instinctively. She whispered softly, "You didn't even wait for thanks." As she looked out into the night, she noticed something strange on her phone. One of the charity organizers had sent her a message saying, "There was a fire downtown this evening near the old shelter, but everyone is safe now." An unknown volunteer helped rescue children before fire trucks arrived. Her eyes widened. Her heart skipped. She stared at the message for a long moment. Unknown volunteer. The timing. The silence. In that quiet moment under the night sky, Sandra felt something inside her shift. She didn't know it yet, But this night would start a journey that would reveal a side of kindness the world had never seen. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, she whispered one more time to herself, maybe he didn't just disappear. Maybe he went somewhere he was needed more. The next morning, Sandra woke up early, long before the city came alive. Her phone was filled with hundreds of messages, interviews, and requests. People were calling the moment from yesterday heroic. Her manager said news networks wanted her and Keanu together for an interview, but Keanu was nowhere to be found. She sat by the window, sipping coffee, watching the city move slowly under the morning light. Her thoughts returned again and again to the same moment, his calm voice saying, "Hold on, you're safe." There was no hesitation, no thought of fame, just instinct. Her assistant entered the room holding a tablet. She said, "Everyone is asking for your statement." Sandra nodded softly and said, "I'll speak, but I don't want to make it about me. I want to talk about how kindness can appear when we least expect it." She paused, then added, "And find out where Keanu went after the event." The assistant looked surprised. She said quietly, "No one knows. He didn't attend the dinner. His car was parked nearby but was gone before the cameras turned. Some people said he went to the hospital. Others said he was seen driving downtown near the fire." Sandra felt something tighten in her chest. She said, "The fire." "The old shelter. Please find out everything about it." A few hours later, she arrived at the charity headquarters. The staff were busy counting donations from the previous night. The director, an elderly woman named Maria, smiled warmly at her and said, "Thank you for attending. Your presence alone inspired people to give." But her smile faded when she noticed Sandra's serious expression. Sandra asked softly, "Maria, did someone help during the fire yesterday? A volunteer, maybe?" Maria blinked, surprised. She said, "How do you know about that?" "Yes, there was a fire near the old shelter for children. No one was hurt. A man arrived before firefighters. He broke the door, carried children out, and disappeared before anyone could ask his name." Sandra's voice dropped to a whisper. "Do you have any photo or record of him?" Maria sighed and said, "Only one small video from a security camera. It's blurry, but we can see a man in a dark coat." Sandra leaned forward, her hands trembling slightly. When the screen played, the faint image of a tall man appeared running into the smoke, holding a small child. Even with the poor quality, Sandra knew the way he moved, the shape of his shoulders, the steady steps that showed calm in chaos. She whispered, "That's him." Maria frowned. "Him who?" Sandra answered quietly. "Keanu." The room fell silent. Maria shook her head almost in disbelief. She said, "Are you sure?" "Why would he hide it?" Sandra didn't answer. She only stared at the screen, her eyes filling with emotion. Later that evening, she drove herself to the burned shelter. Firefighters had left, and the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. The place was small, with toys and broken wood scattered across the ground. She walked through the ruins carefully. Sunlight fell through a hole in the roof, shining on a small corner where a group of drawings were pinned to the wall. One drawing showed a man holding hands with children under a big tree. Beneath it were words written in shaky letters. "Thank you for saving us." Her eyes softened. She turned slowly and noticed something glinting in the ashes. She knelt down and picked up a small wooden piece. It was half burned, with faint words carved into it. She brushed away the dust and could just read, "Be someone's shelter." She froze. Her breath caught. The words were familiar. Years ago, during an old interview, Keanu had spoken about a note he once wrote for himself after losing a close friend. He said, "I try to live by one line, be someone's shelter before they ask." Tears welled up in her eyes. She whispered, "You really did it, didn't you?" She sat there for a long time, holding the burnt tag surrounded by silence. It wasn't just about fame or image for him. It was his way of living. That night, Sandra returned home and opened her laptop. She searched through old interviews, charity mentions, and fan stories. Every few months, someone somewhere had described a quiet stranger helping at shelters, hospitals, or food drives. Each time the description matched Keanu's kindness, but he had never taken credit. Her phone rang. It was Maria. She said softly, "Sandra, one of the children from the shelter wants to meet you. His name is Liam. He drew that picture you found." The next day, Sandra met the boy at the hospital. He was about 8 years old, shy and soft-spoken. When he saw her, his face lit up. He said, "Are you the lady from the big screen?" She smiled and said, "Yes, but I'm here to meet a brave boy." Liam nodded proudly and said, "The man told me to stay brave," he said. "Kindness is stronger than fire." Sandra felt a lump in her throat. She asked gently, "Did he tell you his name?" Liam thought for a moment and said, "He said his name was just someone passing by." She smiled sadly. It was exactly the kind of thing Keanu would say. As she left the hospital, she looked up at the sky, the sun bright behind the clouds. She whispered, "You keep disappearing, but your kindness keeps showing up everywhere." She didn't know yet, but her search was about to uncover a truth that would touch not only her heart, but the hearts of millions who had ever doubted that silent kindness could still exist in this world. The following morning was quiet. Sunlight slipped through the curtains of Sandra's home, but her thoughts were far from calm. She kept replaying the moments in her mind. The surge of the crowd, the calm voice, the burnt tag with those carved words. Every piece felt like part of a bigger story that she couldn't yet see. Sandra opened her notebook and began writing small details she remembered about Keanu that day. She wrote about his coat, his quiet smile, and the way he vanished without saying goodbye. She circled one line and whispered it aloud. He didn't run from attention. He ran toward need. Her phone buzzed. Maria had sent her the contact of a firefighter who was first on the scene at the shelter. His name was Officer Daniels. He agreed to meet her that afternoon. At the fire station, Daniels welcomed her warmly. He was tall, serious-looking, with soot still on his boots from recent work. He said, "Ma'am, I've seen a lot of people panic in fire, but I've never seen someone like that man." Sandra leaned forward, her voice calm but curious. "Can you tell me what you saw?" Daniels took a deep breath and said, "We arrived 3 minutes after the alarm. The flames were strong. The old wood structure was collapsing. I saw a man inside carrying kids one by one. He wrapped his jacket around one of them and used his bare hands to open a blocked door. When I called to him, he waved and said, 'Take care of them.' Then he walked out the back." Sandra felt her throat tighten. She asked softly, "Did he say his name?" Daniels shook his head. "No name, no reward. But he left something on the ground before disappearing. He handed her a small silver keychain shaped like a guitar." Sandra froze. She had seen that keychain before. Years ago, during an interview, Keanu had mentioned keeping a small silver guitar charm as a reminder of a street musician who once taught him patience during his early acting days. She closed her eyes for a second. Her voice trembled as she said, "It's his." That night, she sat alone in her living room, lights dimmed, the burnt tag and the guitar charm resting on the table. She whispered, "What are you hiding, Keanu? Why won't you let anyone know what you do?" Then her assistant entered with a piece of news. A new report was spreading online about a mysterious man seen at different hospitals donating anonymously. In each record, the donation envelope was signed with the initials KR. Sandra smiled slightly and said, "You didn't vanish from kindness. You vanished into it." The next morning, she decided to find him. Not for interviews, not for fame, but to understand the truth behind that quiet instinct he carried. She started with places connected to charity work, small clinics, and volunteer groups. Every place she visited had a similar story. A man with kind eyes, simple words, and no name. At a small children's clinic near downtown, a nurse recognized the photo of Keanu immediately. She said, "Yes, he came last week. He sat with a boy who was scared of surgery. He told the boy stories to keep him smiling. When he left, he told us not to tell anyone. He said, 'Kindness works better in silence.'" Sandra thanked her and stepped outside, feeling her eyes sting with emotion. As she walked toward her car, she saw an old woman sitting by the gate, feeding pigeons. The woman looked up and said softly, "You're looking for the quiet man, aren't you?" Sandra paused, surprised. She nodded and said, "Yes, do you know him?" The old woman smiled faintly. She said, "He helped me cross the road last month when no one else stopped. I told him the world should know his heart. He said, 'No, ma'am, if they know, they'll turn it into noise.'" Those words hit Sandra deeply. She realized his kindness was not hidden. It was simply free from pride. That evening, while driving home, she passed by a bridge where people were lighting candles. She stopped to see what was happening. Volunteers explained that they were honoring the unknown man who saved the children from the fire. Sandra looked around and noticed one small candle with a name carved on it. Someone had written Keanu quietly in the wax. She bent down, touched the candle, and smiled. She whispered, "Someone new." Later that night, she received a message from Maria again. It said, "Sandra, I think you should come to the shelter tomorrow morning. Someone left a box there with your name on it." Her heart skipped a beat. She arrived early the next day, just as the sun was rising. The air still smelled faintly of smoke. In front of the shelter, on a small bench, was a wooden box tied with simple brown string. Her name was written in neat handwriting. She opened it slowly. Inside were a few photographs. Children laughing, volunteers rebuilding walls, and one picture taken secretly at the charity event. It showed Keanu walking away from the crowd, his face turned slightly toward the camera, his expression calm, almost peaceful. Beneath the photos was a small folded note. She unfolded it carefully and read the words, "Don't search for me to thank me. Just continue what the moment began. If we all shield one another, no one will ever be lost in a crowd again." Her eyes filled with tears. She whispered softly, "I understand now." As she stood there holding the note, a little girl from the shelter ran up to her and said, "The man who helped us told me to give you this if you came." She handed her a small charm shaped like a heart. Sandra knelt down and asked, "Did he tell you his name?" The girl smiled and said, "He said his name was someone who stays behind." That night, Sandra sat by her window, the city lights flickering in the distance, and she realized something beautiful. His kindness didn't need to be seen to change the world, and deep down, she knew that her next step would be to make sure the world learned from that silence, not to chase it, but to carry it forward. The next morning, the city was bright and loud again, but Sandra felt different inside. She was no longer just an actress walking into events or interviews. She carried something new in her heart, a quiet understanding that kindness could be louder than fame if it was done in silence. She looked again at the small wooden box Keanu had left. The note inside stayed in her mind like a whisper. "If we all shield one another, no one will ever be lost in a crowd again." She read it again and again, until she felt a deep calm settle inside her. Her assistant entered the room and said softly, "The media is still calling. They want to talk about the video of Keanu saving you." Sandra shook her head and said, "No interviews? Not yet. If I speak, it won't be about the video. It will be about what he did after it." She began to plan quietly. She called Maria, the shelter manager, and asked if she could visit again. When she arrived, children were playing in the half-repaired building. She smiled as she saw Liam, the boy she had met earlier, running with a toy fire truck. Maria walked beside her and said, "The community came forward after you visited. Donations are pouring in. People want to rebuild this place," Sandra said softly. "Good. Then let's do something more. Let's build not just one shelter. Let's start a network, places where anyone can walk in and feel safe." Maria smiled in surprise. "You want to lead that project?" Sandra nodded. She said, "I'll call it the Shelter Project. It's not for fame. It's for the people who believe that kindness should never wait for cameras." Over the next few weeks, Sandra worked in silence. She avoided the spotlight, focusing on finding small towns and burned-down homes where help was needed most. She met volunteers, nurses, and teachers. She used her fame not for attention, but for connection. Wherever she went, she told people the same message. Kindness is stronger when no one claims it. While the world talked about movie awards and red carpets, she spent her nights reading letters from people who had been touched by acts of quiet kindness. A fireman wrote how he gave his boots to a homeless man after hearing about Keanu's story. A student started a fund to fix school roofs. A nurse stayed late at her hospital because she said she wanted to be someone's shelter too. Still, Keanu remained unseen. No phone call, no letter, no visit. But somehow, Sandra felt his presence in everything that was happening. Every time a stranger smiled, every time a volunteer handed food to someone in need, it felt like his quiet spirit was walking beside her. One evening, she received an invitation to a humanitarian film award. Her manager insisted she should attend to speak about her new foundation. She agreed, but she wanted to do something different. She told her team, no fancy lights, no long speech, just honesty. The night of the event, the hall was filled with stars and leaders. Cameras flashed as Sandra walked in, wearing a simple black dress. She walked straight to the stage, holding a small envelope. The crowd went silent as she began to speak. She said, "Last month I was caught in a crowd. I couldn't breathe. I thought I would fall, but someone stepped forward without thinking and shielded me. That man was Keanu Reeves." She paused as soft gasps filled the hall. "But what happened after that moment," she continued, "is something most people don't know. He left not because he wanted to hide. He left because somewhere else children were trapped in fire. And while we were talking about a red carpet, he was carrying them out with his own hands." The room went completely silent. Some people lowered their heads, others wiped their eyes. Sandra raised the burnt wooden tag in her hand and said, "I found this in the ashes of that shelter. It says, 'Be someone's shelter before they ask.'" She held it up to the light and said softly, "That's not a quote for fame. It's a promise for humanity." Then she opened the envelope. Inside was the first project plan for the shelter project. She announced, "Tonight, instead of awards, I want to start something real. I want every person here to build one act of safety, one act of comfort for someone they don't know." The crowd stood and clapped. Cameras flashed, but this time it wasn't about glamour. It was about emotion. Sandra could see tears even in the eyes of people who rarely showed them. And just before she stepped down from the stage, something unexpected happened. One of the technicians from the back came forward carrying a small envelope. He said nervously, "Ma'am, someone left this for you. They said it should be opened only after your speech." Sandra opened it slowly. Inside was a short handwritten note that said, "You did it. You turned a moment into a movement. Keep building shelters. I'll keep finding those who need them." Her heart pounded. She looked around the hall but saw no one. The technician said quietly, "He left just before the event started." She smiled faintly, a tear rolling down her cheek. She whispered to herself, "You're still watching from the crowd." That night, as the city lights glowed outside her car window, Sandra felt peace for the first time since that chaotic day. She knew that even if she never saw Keanu again, their shared moment had already changed countless lives, and somewhere out there, in another quiet corner of the world, she knew he was still being someone's shelter. Instinctively, selflessly and silently. Days passed, then weeks. But the impact of that night didn't fade. Sandra's speech spread across the world. People shared her message in schools, offices, and homes. News anchors called it the movement of quiet kindness. The shelter project grew faster than anyone imagined. Volunteers signed up from every country. Sandra worked day and night. She visited small villages, stood among people rebuilding their homes, and told them stories of hope. Wherever she went, people mentioned Keanu's name, not as a celebrity, but as a symbol of selfless goodness. Still, Sandra never stopped thinking about him. She wondered where he was, what he was doing, and if he even knew how far his simple act had traveled. One morning, Maria called her from the first completed shelter. Her voice was full of joy. She said, "Sandra, the first home is ready. It's beautiful." The children helped paint the walls. "You must come see it." Sandra smiled. She canceled her meetings and drove there the same afternoon. The shelter stood at the edge of the city, near a field of sunflowers. It was small but full of warmth. A wooden sign above the door read, "Home of New Beginnings." Children ran up to her shouting, "Miss Sandra, we made it bright just like you said." She knelt to hug them, her heart full of emotion. Maria handed her a folder. It contained letters from donors and builders. At the bottom was one small envelope with no return name. Sandra opened it carefully. Inside was a folded piece of paper with familiar handwriting. It said, "You turned light into a place. I'll visit when no one's watching." Sandra held the note close to her heart. She didn't need proof. It was enough to know he had seen what their kindness became. As the sun began to set, she sat outside the shelter watching the children play. Laughter filled the air, soft and pure. She whispered, "This is your spirit living on, Keanu." Just then, she noticed a quiet figure walking down the road, wearing a dark jacket and a cap. He stopped near the gate, watching the children. For a moment, Sandra thought her heart had imagined it. But when he looked up, even from a distance, she recognized his calm smile. She stood slowly, unsure if she should go to him. Before she could move, he raised his hand slightly in a small wave. She smiled back. A truck passed by for a moment, and when it cleared, he was gone. Maria came out and asked, "Everything okay?" Sandra nodded, her eyes still fixed on the road. She said softly, "Yes, everything's more than okay." That night, she returned home and opened her journal. She wrote, "Today I saw kindness again. Not in a crowd, not in chaos, but in peace. The man who once shielded me from fear now shields the world from despair. He's not gone. He's everywhere. Someone chooses compassion before comfort." In the following months, shelters appeared in more places: New York, Toronto, Mumbai, and Lisbon. Each one had the same sign with the same line, "Be someone's shelter before they ask." People began calling it the kindness chain. Strangers met through it, friendships formed, and lives changed. None of them knew the full story behind it, but every volunteer spoke of a quiet man and a brave woman who started it all. One evening, while checking reports, Sandra found a photo online. It was taken at a hospital in Canada. The image showed a man sitting beside an injured child reading from a small notebook. The caption said, "Unknown visitor comforts patients at night." The man's posture, his soft hair, his gentle expression, it was unmistakably him. She smiled, tears filling her eyes. She whispered, "You kept your promise. You kept finding them." She opened her window and looked at the stars. The night breeze carried the faint sounds of the city. Horns, laughter, and somewhere, a distant song played by a street musician. She whispered softly, "Someday I'll tell the world who you are, but maybe the world already knows. Not by your name, but by what you left behind." She turned off the lights, the city glowing quietly outside. And in her heart, she knew. The story was not ending. It was just finding new voices, new hands, and new hearts willing to shield someone before they even asked. Months passed, and the shelter project grew beyond everything Sandra had ever imagined. Schools adopted it as part of their kindness programs. Companies sponsored food drives. Cities started adding safe zones called shelter corners for anyone in need. People everywhere were helping strangers and calling it the Reeves way. But through all the love and success, one thing stayed missing: Keanu himself. He had become a legend people spoke about, a man who helped and vanished, whose kindness had no face. Sandra often wondered if he knew that his one small action had sparked a global wave of compassion. One winter evening, a large humanitarian conference invited Sandra to speak as their closing guest. World leaders, actors, and volunteers filled the hall. She planned to use the moment not for fame, but to remind people of the power of silent hearts. Before she left for the event, she looked once more at the burnt wooden tag she still kept framed on her desk. It read, "Be someone's shelter before they ask." She touched it softly and whispered, "This began with you." The stage lights were bright as she walked out. Thousands of people waited in silence. She began speaking calmly, her voice steady but full of feeling. She said, "Months ago, I was trapped in a crowd. Fear closed in and I thought I would fall. But one person stepped forward without hesitation. He shielded me, not because cameras were watching, but because kindness doesn't wait for attention." The audience listened quietly. She continued, "That same man disappeared afterward. I thought I had lost him, but every act of kindness I saw after that was his way of staying present. He reminded me that fame fades, but compassion echoes forever." As she spoke, the lights dimmed slightly for a video presentation. It showed footage of the new shelters being built around the world, children laughing, volunteers working, and people helping strangers. The crowd began to clap slowly, then louder, until the hall was full of emotion. Then Maria walked onto the stage carrying a small box. She whispered to Sandra, "Someone asked me to give this to you right now." Sandra hesitated for a moment. She opened the box, and inside was a folded note and a photo. The note said, "You built what I only dreamed of. Tonight I am here, not on stage, but among them where kindness belongs." Her eyes widened. She looked toward the back of the hall, and her breath caught. In the last row, half hidden among volunteers, sat Keanu. Simple clothes, no cameras, no spotlight, just him, smiling quietly. She froze for a second, overwhelmed by emotion. Then, without hesitation, she stepped down from the stage and began walking toward him. People turned to look. The hall grew silent again. When she reached him, he stood slowly. She said softly, "You never wanted credit. You never wanted thanks. But the world deserves to see the heart behind this." He smiled gently and said, "No, the world already sees it. They see it in you. You became the shelter." She shook her head, tears forming in her eyes. She said, "No, you taught me how. You showed me that one act can change thousands." He replied, "Maybe both were needed. Someone to start it, someone to spread it." The audience, though quiet, began to understand who he was. Murmurs spread, then applause, and finally a standing ovation. It wasn't for fame or stardom, it was for humanity. Keanu looked around the hall, his expression calm. He said softly, "We don't need heroes. We just need people who stay when it matters." Sandra took his hand and led him to the stage. Together they looked at the crowd filled with faces of every age and nation. She said, "This is what happens when silence becomes action, when humility becomes strength." The applause continued for several minutes. Cameras captured the moment, but for Sandra, it felt like time had stopped. The two friends stood side by side, not as celebrities, but as ordinary souls who had turned chaos into compassion. Later that night, when the event ended, Keanu slipped outside quietly. Sandra followed him. They stood near the exit under the soft glow of streetlights. She said gently, "You're leaving again, aren't you?" He nodded. "I go where I'm needed," he said. "There's always someone lost in a crowd somewhere." She smiled sadly and said, "Promise me you'll at least visit the first shelter once more." He looked at her for a moment, eyes kind but distant, and said, "I already did. The children there smile like the sun. That's all the visit I need." She laughed softly through her tears and whispered, "You'll never change." He smiled and said, "Let's hope the world does." Then he walked away quietly into the night. She stood there watching until his figure disappeared in the soft glow of the city lights. The next morning, news spread of their moment on stage. People called it the night kindness spoke. Donations poured in for shelters, schools, and hospitals. It was as if the world had taken a deep breath and remembered what truly mattered. Weeks later, Sandra received one last envelope without a name. Inside was a single photo of children playing under a new shelter with the words painted on the wall, "The Reeves Refuge." Below it was a short note that read, "You kept your promise. Now the world will too." She smiled and placed the photo beside the burnt tag. Outside her window, the city looked peaceful. She whispered, "Thank you for shielding me that day. You didn't just save me from a crowd. You saved my heart." The wind moved softly through the curtains, and for a moment she felt as if he was still there, walking among the people, helping quietly, smiling silently, and from that day on, wherever someone helped a stranger, offered comfort, or chose kindness over pride, a little part of his spirit lived there, proving that true heroes don't wait to be seen, they simply act.